All right, good. Well, Glenn, I think we'll get started. I'll just make a few introductory comments and then we'll move to the next section of the webinar. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this CAFE webinar with Glen Padassery, Executive Vice President, Policy and Chief Consumer Officer at the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario. My name is Keith Martin, and I am Co-Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Financial Institutions in Insurance, or CAFI. On behalf of myself and my co-executive director colleague, Brendan Wicks, and the CAFI Board of Directors, thank you for joining our webinar today. CAFI is a not-for-profit association dedicated to the development of an open and flexible insurance marketplace. Our 14 members include the insurance arms of Canada's major banks and credit unions, along with their insurer business partners, which underwrite credit protection insurance and travel insurance. This is the first in our 2021 series of webinars, which will be focused primarily on issues related to life and health insurance policy and regulation in Canada. I should mention that today's webinar will be recorded and posted on our CAFI website in the near future. Now, if you have any questions that you would like to pose to Glen Padassery during the Q&A session, for which we have allocated 20 minutes during the concluded section of today's webinar, please send them to me as your host using the Q&A function of Zoom, and I will pose them on your behalf. Unless you specifically request in your question that you be identified as its source, I will pose all questions to Glen on an anonymous basis. And just before we get underway, I want to extend a special welcome to some VIP guest attendees. In addition to many representatives from our 14 CAFI member companies and from our 10 associate companies, which supply essential services to our association and our members, we have attendees today from allied industry associations, such as the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association and the Travel Health Insurance Association, and from insurance and financial services regulators and policymakers from across Canada, including the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, the Ministry of Finance, Government of Ontario, the Ministry of Finance, Government of Quebec, the Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority, Government of Saskatchewan, the Office of the Superintendent of Insurance, Government of Nova Scotia, Treasury Board and Finance, Government of Alberta, the Alberta Insurance Council, the Insurance Council of British Columbia, the British Columbia Financial Services Authority, BCFSA, the Real Estate Council of British Columbia, RECBC, and the Federal Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, or OSFI. Welcome to you all. Now, we are very pleased today to have Glen Padassery from the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario executive team as our Fireside Chat guest. Glen is a highly respected senior executive who is responsible for supporting innovation in FSRA's regulated sectors and driving continuous improvement across the organization. In addition to overseeing the authority's key policy development and consumer engagement functions. He works with colleagues to build the analytics capability and environmental awareness necessary to develop and implement FSRA's evidence-based regulatory framework. He is also FSRA's primary liaison with the Ontario Ministry of Finance and other external stakeholders. Glen has extensive policy and consumer protection experience in the public sector, having served previously as Assistant Deputy Minister of Consumer Protection with the Ontario Ministry of Government and Consumer Services. Glen has held senior leadership roles with several Ontario ministries, where his responsibilities span the policy spectrum, from policy development and execution to overseeing administration of consumer protection and public safety legislation, to leading consultations and policy recommendations. Now, I want to mention that just before we formally start the webinar, I want to let you know that we asked Glen if he would like to take this opportunity to introduce to this CAFI webinar audience 2 new directors who recently joined his team at FSRA, and he graciously agreed to do so. So at this time, I will ask Taryn Pimento, Director of FSRA's Consumer Office, and Marlena Labinek, FSRA's Director of Innovation, to turn on their video function on their device so that we'll be able to see you and say hello. And Glen, I'll turn it over to you now to introduce your two colleagues.
Thanks, Keith. And I'm really excited about being here today, but I'm more excited to introduce my team members whom I get to work with and have a privilege of working with closely, Taryn and Marlena. And so as we're here to talk about the work we're doing in the Consumer Office and the Innovation Office, it was appropriate to show the spotlight of the heroes who are actually getting all the work done. So I thought Taryn and Marlena can just quickly introduce themselves and then we can get going.
Great, thanks so much, Glenn. Hi everyone, I'm Taryn Pimento. I'm the Inaugural Director of FSRA's Consumer Office. Over the course of my career, I've supported government transformation and stakeholder engagement work, mostly in the post-secondary education and labor market space. I am new to the world of financial services, and I can say it's been an absolute pleasure to join FSRA and to build out the consumer office and to strengthen our engagement with consumer stakeholders. I know that Glenn is going to talk more about the work that we do in the consumer office, so I'll stop there so I don't steal his thunder, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce myself today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marlena Labinek, and I'm the Director of the Innovation Office. I've been with FSRA for just slightly over a year. This is my first time on the public sector side. Prior to this role, I had the opportunity to lead the innovation team at Canada Life, including the customer experience team, as well as I worked on a number of transformational initiatives for one of the largest banks here in Canada, and many years working in consulting for clients across Europe and North America. I'm very excited to lead the Innovation Office and make some impactful, help drive impactful innovation for our sectors. Pleasure to be here, and Glenn will give you a better insight of what we've been working on for over the past year. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. A special welcome to Taryn and Marlena. It's a pleasure to meet you both. So Glenn, let's jump right into the webinar. And my first question for you is, can you tell us a little bit about your previous career experience in government consumer protection roles and how it prepared you for the Chief Consumer Officer dimensions of your current role at FSRA, which includes overseeing the authority's consumer office?
Absolutely, Keith. So just before I get started, I wanted to just sort of say two things. Appreciate Kathy inviting me to come and speak, mostly because it allows me to get into a collared shirt for the first time after about a year and try and see if my jacket still fit. And just to let everyone know, if you see me taking a sip, this is a eclectic mug that my son made about 10 years ago that I still use to this date. So I just wanted to let everyone know that. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm what is known as a career public servant. I have over 20 years in various roles, but as you mentioned in the opening, most recently as head of what was known as Consumer Protection Ontario. And they're responsible for consumer protection acts across various marketplaces, like the licensing of real estate brokers or responsibility for public safety, such as electrical codes and standards, just to name a few. I also had responsibility for oversight of 12 different agencies, and they were actually known as, or they're currently known as administrative authorities in Ontario. Some of you may be familiar with them, such as the Tarion New Home Warranty Corporation, the Electrical Safety Authority of Ontario, or the Travel Industry Council of Ontario, just to name a few. What's really important, I think, is to highlight my role and experiences as policymaker across different areas. I have background in social policy, economic policy, and regulatory policy. And one of the key highlights for me is that I'm able to bring advice that brings all voices to the table. It balances different perspectives and finds a right approach or approaches to identify problems or solutions. So going back to your question on how did this prepare me for my role at FSRA, I'm aware that in order to be an effective regulator, we need to identify the voices of the people we're here to serve. And we serve the public interest, but we do that through our regulated sectors. So it's important to be able to provide a balance, if I'm using that term generically, with our approaches to regulating. Secondly, and particularly for the voice of the consumer, I'm a champion for the voices that aren't heard. So trying to find ways to get them to understand what the problem is or isn't, coming up with solutions that will lead to or work to the intended outcomes we're seeking and help people buy into the path forward. And finally, in terms of rulemaking, I'm a student of what is known as PBR, or principles-based regulation. The main point on this is that the regulators should be focusing on outcomes and not outputs, and try and steer away from the prescriptiveness of what is traditionally known as for the sake of it, or only use it when it's absolutely necessary.
That's really insightful, Glenn, and I certainly think that as a regulated, as an organization supporting regulated entities, we're also aware of the challenges that regulators and policymakers face in terms of that balance. It's a very delicate one, and I do appreciate how challenging that must be. And I want to pick up on that sort of theme of the balance by asking you about some of the factors that went into FSRA's recent decision to adopt the CCIR CISRO 2018 document guidance, Conduct of Insurance Business and Fair Treatment of Customers, as the standard for fair treatment of customers in the insurance sector. You previously had the FSCO Treating Financial Consumers Fairly guidance, and you inherited that as FSRA. And there was some concern in industry about having to sort of monitor and follow two related but slightly different guidances. And so I know industry really appreciated FSRA's decision to move to only one guidance. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's true. As the predecessor regulators, both requirements and both guidances apply to the insurance industry sort of at the same time. And as you noted, we inherited the Treating Financial Consumers Fairly guidance from FSCO, along with lots of other inherited guidance. And in our first year of operation, we had committed to reviewing all of our inherited guidance. Unsurprisingly, as you mentioned, FSRA was hearing from industry that it was confusing to have two different pieces of guidance that weren't essentially aligned. And after consultation with the sector, including both the larger national as well as our regional participants, we took action to clarify, ensure harmonization, and reduce regulatory burden by endorsing the single standard, which of course favored adopting the CCIR CISRO FTC guidance. Across all the sectors we regulate, we'll continue to promote a national dialogue on harmonization and an approach to regulatory issues. And the FTC guidance that we've discussed is an important example of how we chose to do that. We're continuing that trend. I'm pleased to talk about two other sectors that we've been able to move forward on this space. We recently worked across the other regulators in the mortgage broker space, and as a collective, we've nationally adopted a code of conduct for mortgage brokers. And in the credit union space, we're similarly working to support implementation of an industry adopted code of conduct that would apply across Canada. So we're really focusing on that and the outcomes that that's trying to achieve.
That's really interesting, Glenn. Thank you for sharing that. And it's sort of a good segue into the broader issue of regulatory harmonization. I was just speaking a few days ago with a colleague at another association, and she was mentioning that in California, a jurisdiction of roughly the same population as Canada, there's one insurance regulator. And in Canada, we have the 10 provinces, 3 territories. Of course, some of the provinces have not just a regulator, but also a licensing authority. So we did a quick count, and I think we have 17 regulatory authorities that we need to follow. So it's not a surprise. That's one of the issues that industry often raises. And I know it's something that you at FSRA and in your own capacity do think about. What I'd like to ask you, Glenn, is if you could tell us about some of the other initiatives that FSRA has been undertaking as a key player at national coordinating bodies such as CCIR and CISRO to support regulatory harmonization across the 13 provincial and territorial jurisdictions that we have in Canada.
For sure, Keith. And let me do a special shout out to the other National Association members. This is not an Ontario only view. This is actually a Canadian view, that there are better regulatory outcomes through collaborative efforts with our other regulatory bodies and partners, including Ontario, across Canada, and frankly, internationally. And so our mandate, which is actually set out in our legislation, includes cooperation and collaboration with other regulators to support harmonization. So as you mentioned, we participate actively as a member in over 10 national and international associations or forums. So I'm going to try and approach your answer by looking at the Canadian context, and then I want to briefly talk about the international landscape. In the Canadian view, our objectives of participation in these forums are to support industry strength and stability across all participating jurisdictions, enhance regulatory cooperation and reduce the redundancies, develop rules that are integrated and more effective in achieving consumer protection outcomes, promoting innovation and economic growth by encouraging new business models, but lastly, but most importantly, enhance the protection of consumers by promoting effective supervisory standards. And so on the pan-Canadian view front, we actually provide all of the secretariat supports to the national associations, such as CCIR and CISRO. And through that, we're able to help support national harmonization initiatives, as well as help influence and shape the agenda. So that's a really unique position that Ontario's in. And I want to call out the regulatory coordination branch in our team that actually helps support that for all of the regulators across Canada. Internationally, and I actually want to take a point to give Kathy a shout out here. It was through your input as a valued stakeholder that FSRA moved forward to become a member of the IAIS, which is the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. That gives us another foothold in the space to understand globally what's happening and how to influence the Canadian and Ontario, and perhaps one day influence the international landscape. So thank you, Kathy, for pushing us hard on that. And I know that was something that you guys have been pretty vocal about, and we did move forward on that. On the consumer protection side, internationally, we became a member of something called FinConet, which is an international financial consumer protection organization consortium focusing on market conduct supervision. And on the innovation side, we are members of what's known as the Global Financial Innovation Network, or GIFIN, which is a group of financial regulators across the world focused on providing a way for firms to interact with regulators between jurisdictions as they look to scale new ideas. So this allows us and firms to participate in global sandboxes and sets a framework for cooperation with other regulators. So that's sort of what we're looking at when we look at the Canadian context, but more importantly, and as we're shifting and maturing, how we're going to start influencing and participating in the international space.
Well, that's great, Glenn. Thank you. And I did know that you had applied and been accepted at the IAIS, and I think I speak for our members and my co-executive director, Brendan Wicks, when we say we think that that is very positive news. And I think it will bring a lot of benefits to yourself and more broadly. Glenn, we heard from Taryn Pimento, director of your consumer office, about how enthusiastic she is about that part of FSRA, and I know it's something very important to you. We'd love to hear more about the mandate and activities to date of the consumer office and what you see as some of its future priorities. So could I just leave it as a very open question and ask you just to share with us your priorities in that area?
For sure. And as Taryn mentioned, the consumer office was formed in early 2020. And by form, we mean we hired Taryn and she started. And so I wanted to really talk about the infancy of the consumer office as sort of just establishing its roots and growing. I wanted to point out that when I use the term consumer and the consumer office, it's actually inclusive of the general consumers that your sector serves, but also includes folks like the credit union members and pension plan beneficiaries. So my consumer view of the world is beyond just the general consumer that would be in the marketplace. And the mandate of the consumer office is to serve as the consumer voice within FSRA. It's not the only voice, but it's one of our main conduits. This means supporting the organization to access valuable insights from consumers and to think really carefully about how our regulatory and policy activities impact the consumers on the sectors that we regulate. So given our statutory obligation, so the legislation that governs us says our obligation is to protect the rights and interests of consumers, the consumer office really helps us keep the consumer at the center of our thinking throughout all of our processes, but particularly in the policymaking process. So the specific mandate of the consumer office includes conducting consumer research, setting the strategy for FSRA's consumer engagement and education in the regulated sectors, leading select cross-sectoral projects. So for example, right now, The consumer office is looking at how we improve the system for consumers when they make a complaint and how to improve the efficacy around consumer disclosures, just as two quick examples. And finally, providing support for the consumer advisory panel. And the consumer advisory panel, to me, is a really important part of our stakeholder engagement process. It's an advisory body that provides advice to FSRA from a consumer perspective on FSRA's proposed policy changes and our regulatory activities. So that's generally the high level of what we do, and I'm happy to get into more detail if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I would like to get into a little bit more detail, Glenn, on the last component you just mentioned, which is the Consumer Advisory Panel. I know that in January 2020, you announced its creation. You appointed, I believe, 9 individuals as its founding membership. And I did read with great interest your April 8th release of a 2020 annual report from the Consumer Advisory Panel. And in its very short time in existence, it certainly has done an impressive amount of work. Perhaps you could share with us a little bit more about its terms of reference, its activities to date. But in particular, Glenn, I'd be interested in understanding how it fits into the mandate of the Consumer Office, and in particularly, how it helps shape policy at FSRA, because I know that policy is another key component of your overall responsibility as Executive Vice President. So if it's all right, those are some additional areas that we would find some more detail quite insightful.
Yeah, happy to expand on that. So as I mentioned earlier, the Consumer Advisory Panel, I actually think of, when I think about policy and when we're formulating policy, the stakeholder engagement process is integral to making sure we're formulating the right advice based on the input we receive from stakeholders, and the integrity of the process is important. So the Consumer Advisory Panel is a key component to FSRA's policymaking process. So it serves as an advisory body. The Consumer Advisory Panel, I'll call it the CAP for short, serves the advisory body through the Consumer Office. In practical terms, what that means is the CAP provides advice directly to the FSRA policy teams on all of our consumer-focused policy issues. They bring forward their own ideas and recommendations for FSRA's consideration, and they help the Consumer Office understand some of the perspectives and experiences of consumers. So in doing so, CAP helps the Consumer Office achieve its mandate to serve as the consumer voice within FSRA. The CAP is actually something we've seen before. So for example, the OSC has the Investor Advisory Panel, MFDA and IROC have similar investor representatives for input and feedback, and other regulators have consumer advisory structures in place. What I'd like to emphasize, though it's different, I think, is really about the multi-sector orientation and the nature of the partnership that we have with the Consumer Advisory Panel. So as you mentioned on the annual report that they just issued, they had actually 4 meetings during their inaugural term in 2020, and it's scheduled to actually meet 6 times during the 2021 year. And that's in addition to ad hoc meetings that they would have either at our request or their own request. And so these meetings provided a forum for FSRA and the CAP members to engage on issues that are related to our annual priorities. And this year, CAP has played a strong role in setting their own agenda. So we actually asked them to identify topics that they want us to respond to and react to. And that's actually made it part of the work plan for this year that we're going to be building out. And CAP's input has shaped or informed our policy approach in meaningful ways, but I want to give you a relevant example of a contribution of the CAP that's been super impactful. Last fall, CAP and the Consumer Office co-hosted a series of engagement sessions to discuss the proposed minimum standards for financial planner and financial advisor title users. And these sessions brought over 20 consumer stakeholders with diverse backgrounds, including academics, consumer protection advocates, and general public interest stakeholders. The feedback from this engagement informed CAP's own submission to FSRA's public consultation on the proposed rule. This kind of consumer participation and feedback is crucial for our rulemaking because the consumer voice is not always present in regulator engagement efforts. So here's what's actually the importance of what they did. Their advice actually influenced our work. So we took their input, and the policy team went back and actually made changes to the proposed rule as a direct result of their insights and feedback. So I'm fortunate, and FSRA is fortunate, to have this collaborative relationship with CAP along with a network of consumers who are interested in sharing their perspectives and working with FSRA through the consumer office. Ultimately, the hope is, and of course, we're starting to see this grow, is that CAP becomes experts in their own right and can provide us and the sectors themselves with insights across various work underway that translates into meaningful engagement and represents consumer stakeholders. So this means that we have to educate and build up the competencies of the CAP, and they in turn bring us perspectives that we can use in our policymaking work.
That's really interesting, Glenn. Just a quick follow-up. Were there any surprises that the CAP shared with you in terms of findings, in terms of consumer experiences or consumer concerns? And
Related to the financial planners?
No, just more generally.
Oh, actually, so yeah, you know what? We technically like to think that we know how consumers think and behave, and I would actually say that they brought us perspectives that go beyond our traditional sense of what we think we know as a regulator or as sector says that consumers behave. I actually think the main learning from us is really around the different capabilities of consumers related to their comprehension, their resilience, their biases, and their experiences. And that's actually really influenced the work that Taryn and her team are doing around consumer insights and persona development and journey mapping to show that a one-size-fits-all approach around how you engage consumers or what consumers' views are is really important, that we don't take that for granted. So it's the different perspectives they bring has been the most enjoyable aspect and learning for me that I hadn't actually been, aware to or attuned to before.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight, Glenn. I mean, I think in a similar vein, often business thinks about ways in which it can offer new manners of communicating with consumers. And we've seen that, happen to a significant degree over the past year and a bit, where digitization had to become a much more important way of sharing information with consumers. But it's a two-way street. And what's also remarkable is how readily consumers have adjusted and adapted and taken on new means. And in fact, we recently learned that a majority of Canadians have enhanced their technology in order to be better able to adjust to the current realities. So I think your point about consumers' adaptability is one that really rings home here. Glenn, I want to move from the CAP to another body that you've recently joined. Last July, you were one of 15 members appointed by federal FCAC Commissioner Judith Robertson, who you would obviously know previously and personally from her time as a member of FSRA's founding, initially 3-person board of directors. And you were appointed to the FCAC's renewed Consumer Protection Advisory Committee, or CPAC. Could I ask you to speak about your involvement on that FCAC Consumer Focused Committee and how it adds value to both FSRA and the FCAC? And also be interested to know if it helps foster harmonized regulatory approaches at both the federal and the provincial territorial levels.
For sure. And just as a point of clarification, Judith was a former board member of FSRA, but for clarity, there was a significant vetting process on FCAC's behalf in terms of who went on the CPAC, and it was actually FSRA, including myself and Taryn, who was chasing the membership as opposed to the other way around. So we actually wanted to participate and join the group as opposed to them sort of knocking on our door through the relationship. And just for FCAC's view of the CPAC, it's to provide advice in support of FCAC's mandate, their priorities, their objectives, inputs on the emerging trends, issues, and research that they're doing on a national scale. I find the participation is very valuable because I can bring insights from FSRA to inform FCAC's consumer protection efforts, but I'm also able to learn lessons from FCAC and the other members in terms of informing our own policymaking at FSRA. So it's not surprising to anyone that experiences here in Ontario are likely being witnessed across other jurisdictions. And that's a great opportunity to either A, have a harmonized approach to how we address them, as you sort of alluded to, or B, really get a heads up on things that may be coming down the pipeline. So we have a sort of early warning sign. If something's happening somewhere else, we can start thinking about how we might address it if it came into the Ontario context. So it is very much a two-way sharing arrangement, and there's mutual benefit. We ended up working really closely with FCAC on some key pandemic consumer protection issues as a result of my participation in CPAC. Now, I'll give you an example. Credit scoring on deferrals for payments was one that we wanted to ensure we had an aligned approach, and regulatory relief measures that were offered by the federal regulator and Ontario regulator. We wanted to ensure that we were aligned in sharing information about what we were doing and what they were doing. And that's a really good example of in practice how that can work. And another type of example on a more macro level is greater collaboration on the policy work that we're doing on, for example, the review of our complaints framework, including dispute resolution, and getting broader perspectives on consumer insights that go across Canada as opposed to just an Ontario only view.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Glen. I just want to remind attendees on this webinar that you are definitely invited to pose some questions through the Q&A function of Zoom, and I'll ask them on your behalf. And in fact, Glen, we have a question that's related to some of the comments you've just made in the past few minutes, so I thought I'd jump in on it since it's relevant to this section. And the question is FSRA able to share with CAFI your research findings regarding the client personas?
Absolutely. So I think the more that we work together with the regulated sectors on the work that we're doing, it actually is mutual benefit, because businesses do market intelligence and consumer research to 10 times to the extent that FSRA does it, but the foundational work that we're doing is actually going to be really helpful, and we would be pleased to set up meetings through Taryn's office to share the work that they're doing around consumer insights, persona development, and journey mapping. Absolutely.
Well, that's great. I think that would be very interesting for our members, so we'll definitely follow up with Taryn on that. Thank you, Glen. I want to return to one of the themes that we touched upon before, Glen, which is this balance that a regulator always needs to find between different parts of its mandate. And I want to move in particular at this time to FSRA's focus on consumer protection, as evidenced by many of the things that we've talked about, including the Consumer Advisory Panel and other initiatives that you've mentioned. And I'd like to ask you to give us a sense of how the authority tries to achieve the right and optimal balance between, on the one hand, consumer protection and consumer rights, and consumer responsibilities on the other hand.
So it's a great question. And I'm going to start off by making a provocative statement. I actually believe an informed consumer is the best weapon in the world for a regulator. Someone who understands their own rights, obligations, and can advocate for themselves makes the system function as it should with limited intervention. So that's my sort of opening salvo into that balance around rights and responsibilities. I would say that FSRA generally expects consumers to take reasonable responsibility for their choices and decisions. But we also know that consumers have differing levels of financial capability, financial resilience, behavioral biases, and barriers. And this makes it difficult for regulators to set universal expectations around consumers. So just like businesses, no two customers are treated or behaved in the exact same way. So our regulatory efforts are designed to recognize the factors that affect an individual's capacity to make an informed decision. So this really underscores why we need to continue to better understand consumers of the regulated sectors, including to help us identify where consumers may be more vulnerable to harm along the journey map and the transaction. So I think this actually highlights the need for different players in the ecosystem, FSRA as a regulator, industry, and consumers themselves to have different but complementary roles when it comes to supporting consumer understanding and decision-making, which are fundamental to consumer responsibility. We as FSRA have a responsibility to promote public education and knowledge about the regulated sectors. And in support of that, we've committed to developing and publishing a framework on consumer education. So that's actually some active work that Taryn's team is working on right now. And that framework will help consumers better understand both their rights and their responsibilities. We also play a role around consumer disclosure. which is one vehicle to support consumer understanding and decision-making. And industry partners have a responsibility to consider consumer interests and needs, ensure consumer suitability, but also help consumer understand their risks and entitlements. So it's really about the ecosystem working together in harmony, but absolutely there is a responsibility of consumers to understand what they're getting into when they get into it.
Well, thank you for that, Glenn. And I do have a question from the audience that sort of digs into this issue a little bit more deeply. I'd say it's a fairly nuanced or subtle question, and let me just share it with you. It's as follows. From FSRA's perspective, can you speak to any distinction between consumer protection and fair treatment of consumers?
That's a good question. So you're catching me on the cuff here. So let me just try and articulate it in a way that sounds legible. I actually think there's a distinction. So fair treatment goes back to this point around people understanding their responsibilities of how they're supposed to behave in the marketplace transaction. And consumer protection is really about making sure that there is recourse available for people who have been wronged in the transaction, and making sure that there's someone to step in to intervene on their behalf. And so it goes back to my point around intervention and about making sure that the market functions the way it does. If people all treated consumers fairly, then there wouldn't be the need for a regulator to actually exist. However, there are going to be cases of bad actors where you need to have tools at your disposal, which is, in my case, what I call consumer protection tools, to be able to provide recourse, recompense, or sanctions against people who are not behaving the way that the market intended. So I'm trying to take a stab at trying to understand what to make the distinction between what FTC is versus what consumer protection is. And I think what I'm trying to say is they go along a continuum.
I think that's a really good answer, Glenn. I know that we, CAFE, in the past, in our consultations with CCIR on fair treatment of customers, have observed that FCT is very powerful, but also very challenging to measure because it's about culture. It's about your attitude, the way you behave. It's ingrained in the DNA of an organization, and so it's not about enforcement, but about the approach you bring. Culture, I think, is the right term, and such things, of course, are very important, but they can be very hard to demonstrate, very hard to measure. So that was one of the conversations we certainly had with CCIR, and asking them for their own input into how we can best demonstrate, that it is occurring when it is occurring.
Right.
I want to talk about innovation. Just given the pace of change in the environment we've seen just around technology and digitization, but it's not just about the last year and a bit, it precedes it. This has been an ongoing trend for quite a while. And both for industry and for regulators, the ability to promote an environment where innovation can thrive is critical to even a country's success. So let me ask you about your areas of focus around innovation and what resources you have at your disposal to achieve the authority's innovation objectives. And I might start off to some degree with internal innovation at FSRA, including regulatory technology, or RegTech, and how that is contributing to FSRA being the type of regulator that it wants to be.
It's a great question, and happy to segue into the sort of the innovation space. So similar to the Consumer Office, the Innovation Office was created in early 2020. I think I want to talk about the resources a little bit. We at FSRA are not resource rich. We are what I like to call in the policy area, we're a small but mighty team, and that includes the Innovation Office. So when I think about the organizational model at FSRA, innovation is actually a shared objective. It's led by the Innovation Office, but it's owned by everyone at FSRA. So the Innovation Office works sort of like an orchestrator model. It focuses on coordinating across the organization on innovation activities and leveraging the expertise of the core regulatory areas, essentially the sector regulators. And we're really still at the early stages of our internal innovation journey. And I think sometimes when you're a startup, you can use that as an excuse, but it's actually for us focusing on how we need to evolve to remain effective in the changing technology pace that we're dealing with. And let me talk about a couple of examples. One is really our multi-year digital transformation journey. And so innovation means different things to different people. And at FSRA, and I'm sure the regulated sector would appreciate this, moving from old paper-based disparate processes to a truly end-to-end integrated system, which is supported by technology, is one of the outcomes we're moving to. And that's a multi-year journey we started last year, and we're continuing on, and it's going to be a few more years before we're fully at the end state, but we're starting to make some real strides there. And there's lots of work when you talk about reg tech and otherwise known as soup tech. That's really about data and what you do with data. And there's lots of work going on at FSRA around our data and analytics strategy. And we know that's important when you want to be a data-driven organization. And that's one of the sort of strategic pillars that we're going to be moving forward on, is how do we make our decisions based on evidence, which is built on the data that is actually useful for people. And I'm going to make the other side of that comment when it talks about burden. And when I think about burden reduction, I want to make sure that it's useful data. So sometimes you find out that people ask a lot of questions and there's no purpose for the information. And so we just want to make sure you have the right information and you can provide the right analytics around that. And then on our broader innovation journey, we've actually created our inaugural innovation strategy, which really includes what our innovation ambition statement is as a regulator and our guiding principles. And we proposed an initial operating model and carved out the role of the innovation office in the sort of overall enterprise. And we've defined end-to-end processes for identifying and delivering innovation opportunities, including details on regulatory testing environments. So in the coming months, and literally in the coming months, stay tuned on this information on how we're going to launch our test and learn environment.
Thanks for that, Glenn. And I do recall early in the days of FSRA that the senior management team made the very direct statement that you would not collect data unless you were intending to use it. And I know that's highly appreciated by industry. Of course, as a regulator, you need information, and it's industry's responsibility to supply it. But it is frustrating if it's provided and then it doesn't seem to be translated into something pragmatic. So that discipline is I think, certainly well appreciated. Let me stay with the theme of innovation. We talked about FSRA and some of the things you're doing around it and internally. And I'm wondering if you could now expand on that in terms of what your objectives are with respect to fostering industry innovation external to your organization. In other words, helping provide opportunities for innovation in insurance, which is of particular interest to Kathy. And any examples of any strategies that you are or will be pursuing in that area?
For sure. And so Marlena is going to be, she's going to be cross with me because I'm going to give actually elements of the strategy which we haven't actually released yet. So, to the CAFE members, enjoy being part of what I call the VIP crowd on us describing the innovation strategy in more detail before it goes out live. But the Innovation Office will essentially coordinate a 5-step process to manage and deliver on innovation initiatives. And this will include opportunity intake. So where innovation opportunities are discovered and explored. And we'll be looking outwardly to sort of canvas for new ideas, but we're also going to be looking for ideas to come to us. And what I want to highlight there is we're going to have a no wrong door approach. So it's not going to be that you have to only go through the innovation doorway in order to be heard. As I mentioned earlier, innovation is a shared objective. So any door you enter into FSRA is going to take you along the innovation pathway to help you and support the work that you're trying to get out. But that's going to lead us to what's the second step, which is prioritization and management. So where innovation opportunities are assessed, prioritized, and then selected based on established criteria. And that's going to lead us to the third step, which is opportunity definition and solutioning. So where we assess projects against what our regulatory tools are available to us and how they should be used. That then leads us to what I call the fourth step, which is called risk assessment and testing. So where projects are assessed for potential risks that require further testing and validations through tools like a test and learn environment, which is in the sort of outward world, it's called a regulatory sandbox or a testing sandbox. And then finally, and I want to make sure this is really clear, is communication and measurement. So where we actually have a role in communicating out innovation opportunities, we develop outreach plans to engage with other stakeholders, and the impact of the initiatives are measured through the consumer groups, sector groups, and regulatory benchmarks. So there's some key takeaways of this strategy that I want to sort of make sure is heard, is what's good for you is going to be good for others. So if somebody brings something forward for testing and we accept it, it's actually going to be open for everyone. It's not going to be just open for one or the one participant. And we're not going to be prioritizing new entrants versus what I call the existing incumbents. Everyone will have an opportunity, and we'll work to ensure that they are properly assessed and prioritized. We're encouraging dialogue. Come talk to us and we'll work with you on your needs and how we can help. And finally, and I want to underscore this, it's protecting the public interest. I don't want to lose sight of that we're always first and foremost a regulator and want to make sure that consumer harm is ultimately mitigated. So I am jumping ahead, but we plan on conducting actual public consultations and soliciting feedback on the framework and the test and learn environment in the coming months.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
Glenn, I just want to ask you if you could also talk to us a little bit more about the regulatory sandbox.
For sure. And so the sandbox is what FSRA actually calls a test and learn environment. So I'll use that term interchangeably. So starting with the why. So this was actually based on feedback from stakeholders. The government of Ontario, and by extension FSRA, have heard that existing rules and laws are overly prescriptive and actually inhibit new business models from entering the market. So prescriptive requirements often directly discourage market participants from innovating as they don't see a need to do so. So how can we support you? So measures like exemptions, which is what the government moved forward on, are actual tools for a regulator to exercise a form of discretion to facilitate innovation in the marketplace with safeguards. Example of the safeguards would be like terms and conditions. And by enacting the exemptive authorities granted by the government through what we're calling the test and learn environment, will allow for controlled environments and testing, if necessary, to happen within the sectors and validate their effectiveness and build the necessary safeguards into the parameters after such tests. So what that means is this will allow us to make future changes through our rules or the government through its lawmaking that can let these become permanent changes in the regulated sectors once we understand what it is that people are trying to achieve, what the barriers are, what the risks might be that might be imposed on consumers, and how we can actually mitigate that. So, and a little bit more around the existing exemptions that were recently posted by the government, they will prioritize the auto insurance market, but there are exemptions that apply to the entire insurance sector as a whole, and those are hopefully readily apparent in the actual draft regulations that went out for public consultation. But as I mentioned, the exemptive authority that is granted by government is only one of the many tools we're planning on utilizing to support innovation. So the bottom line is we're encouraging everyone to come and speak with us if you have a great idea and you need some assistance on where you might want to take it.
Right, that is certainly something that we noticed, that it was a P&C principally, and if I've understood you correctly, that's the initial emphasis, Glenn, but this will eventually move down the road to life and health?
So yes, but I would say don't wait for the initial P&C only. Come talk to us if you're interested in doing something now. It's a continuous intake process. So while the government enacted some regulatory changes for us, we're looking at what other tools we have in place to be able to support innovation right now.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. That's a helpful subtlety. We have a question from the audience. I'll just read it, Glenn. It goes as follows. Any further insights on the intersection of fair treatment of customers and the self-serve digital marketplace? will you be thinking about a modified principles-based approach for this segment?
So that's a great question. And let me just talk about PBR in general. And so if you think about principles-based regulation, it focuses on outcomes, and it is essentially a no one-size-fits-all approach. So in theory and in practice, it shouldn't matter what the channel choice is. It should really focus on the outcomes that the consumer is receiving or is sort of feeling. And if that's the case, then the digital channel is unimportant to the idea of how we supervise. In fact, all it really is, and I'll go back to Keith, you made a comment around it, is about whether you have systems, processes, and procedures in place to manage against fair treatment of consumers and have a way to understand how that's being implemented in your organization. So hopefully I've answered that question.
Yes, no, I think you have. Thank you. I think one of the themes that we've heard from you today, Glen, is the importance of looking at things from a consumer perspective and ensuring that consumers are being treated properly. And part of that, of course, and you referenced it, is for consumers to be well educated, to be well aware of their choices and options. And so I wanted to ask you if you could comment on that whole area, and in particular, any initiatives which FSRA has or plans to introduce around financial literacy. And in relation to that, are there any opportunities in your view for industry players to support FSRA's efforts around financial literacy?
Sorry, let me just get off my, let me just get off the chat there for sure. So this year, we've made a commitment to develop a consumer education framework and to pilot some new consumer education priorities. And one example of a sector-specific initiative is our plan to develop a campaign on financial professional title protection. So consumer education will be a pillar of that activity because it's important for consumers to understand how they'll be protected and how they won't be protected through the new legislation and FSRA's regulatory efforts. And there is absolutely a role that industry can play in supporting this. First and foremost, and I think I mentioned this earlier, you know your customers better than anyone. And meeting customers where and consumers where they are, industry definitely has a role in supporting us with this. So again, I go back to this key point around the outcome. For me, it always matters about what the outcomes, that consumers get the information they need when they need it in order to make informed decisions. And that being said, we would definitely appreciate any opportunity to partner and look forward to discussions on that from whomever wants to actually work with us on this. It's a great idea.
Thank you for that, Glen. I'm sure that we will definitely follow up with you. I want to just build on the comments that have been made by you around initiatives at FSRA as well as at the national level through CCIR and CISRO, and go a little further and ask you, in terms of your consumer office and in terms of some of your consumer activities, have you had any inspirations from other international jurisdictions?
So that's a great question. I actually will tell you that I actually think that the consumer office is a unique sort of view for other regulators. And when we actually did a scan out to other regulators to see whom else was doing this. And so I'll remind everyone, which is also important, the consumer office actually stems from the expert panel report, which was actually released in 2016 or 2017. It actually recommended a standalone consumer office to become the voice of the consumer, not an advocate role, but a challenge function. So why I think that's unique for a regulator, having worked across multiple different market regulators, not just in the financial services sector, there is no other model that I'm aware of where it's designed the same way. And in particular, the uniqueness of this model is how the consumer office is actually embedded in the policy function of FSRA. So when I go back to the principles of what is called user-centered design, and the fact that as FSRA matures, it will have greater rulemaking authority, having the consumer office in the same space as the rulemaking thinkers is actually important because you're essentially designing with the consumer perspectives throughout the entire policy lifecycle. So I'm privileged enough to wear two hats as the EVP of policy and the Chief Consumer Officer, but having this dual role really supports the office to be integrated in a way that it works with our internal partners to fulfill its function across FSRA's priority setting and policy development. So I'd like to say we're one of a kind, and I'm hopeful that others find, can learn from our experiences, which we'd be happy to talk about, and sort of show how engaging in the consumer viewpoints when you're designing things for consumers ultimately is actually going to lead to better outcomes than having them comment on things after the fact.
All right, thank you, Glenn. The hour has certainly flown by, and it's really been enjoyable and interesting. I'm going to end with one final question from the audience. And the question is FSRA able to expedite the timelines during the 5-step process and Sandbox with consumer expectations for speed of innovation? And the follow-up comment is, technology becomes outdated quickly, and fintech providers could get to a 2.0 version before the regulated process is completed.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. So we, as part of the innovation framework, and again, I want to have the opportunity for the actual innovation framework to be posted for comment, but the innovation framework does anticipate or contemplate a expedited approvals process. Again, what really comes down to for me is around the assessment side. So what are we looking for in terms of the data and the information that will help us figure out whether this is something that should actually be allowed in the market on a more longer term scale, which ultimately will lead to, because in theory, it's prohibited by a legislation, a regulation, or rule. In theory, that will actually lead to long-term changes in the system that we're trying to advocate for. But short answer is we have contemplated fast tracking and what that means, and we're still working out the details, but we'd be happy to get feedback from fintech or other industry groups or other industry players on what that can mean for them.
Thank you, Glenn. I can't tell you how much we appreciate the open, collaborative approach that you and FSRA have continuously demonstrated. This sort of opportunity for a conversation and to hear your priorities is tremendously valuable to us. And as I said, the hour flew by because of how interesting all the information was. So Glenn, on behalf of CAFI and its members, I just want to really genuinely thank you for this time. And we very much look forward to continuing discussing these matters with you and to keeping the doors open for further consultations and interaction. Thank you.
And Keith and Brendan, on behalf of FSRA, thank you for inviting myself here today to have that conversation. My one takeaway for all of this, if I can give folks one key takeaway, is we really want to engage in a meaningful dialogue with you. So, hopefully you'll see that we're open for business in terms of having conversations either on consumer insights and research and things that we're doing there, or on the innovation side. So don't hesitate to reach out. We'd be happy to have a conversation and see how we can support.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Glenn, and to all the attendees on this CAFI webinar. This webinar is now completed. Thank you for attending and have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.